Welcome to part 3 of my study on end times prophecies. I'm so excited that you have joined me today. Hopefully, you've watched parts 1 and 2, but it's not required. You're welcome to dive in at any point in the study. I just encourage you to grab your Bible and a notebook because we are going deep. So, in our previous parts, we have looked at the prophecies, the visions that were recorded in Daniel 2 with Nebuchadnezzar's dream about a large statue, as well as the visions that Daniel had of the four beasts in Daniel 7, which we compared to the final beast that John describes in Revelation 13 and 17. So, in part 2, because we focused on the prophecies describing the beasts, we skipped over a couple of visions that Daniel also records in Daniel 7 that also have to do with the end times. And so I want us to go back into Daniel 7 and touch on those visions so that in our study, we're not leaving any known end times prophecies unaddressed and undiscussed. So that's what we're going to be starting on if you want to go and grab your Bibles and join in with me. Otherwise, I'll have the verses on the screen for you. So the first vision that we skipped over can be found in verses 9 and 10 of Daniel 7. And they say, "As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened." So the first question we have about this vision is, who is it talking about? And the second question we have is, what is it talking about? So we can take some clues from verse 9 and compare it to what John records seeing in Revelation 1 to find out who is being described here. So I have those side by side now on your screen, and we just read Daniel 7:9. So let me read from Revelation 1:13 through 15 to compare. So John says, "In the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his chest. The hairs of his head were white, like white wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace, and his voice was like a roar of many waters." So who are is Daniel and John in Revelation? Who's being described here? Well, of course, it is Jesus Christ in his glorified body. And that is who is being described in both visions. And I just love how we can see side by side that they're seeing the same person, that both his clothing and his hair, it's white like wool, like snow. There's flames, there's fire. Okay. And we also see that in Daniel 7:9, though, he's referred to as the Ancient of Days, and it says that he took his seat and the thrones were placed there. So now let's answer the question of what's being talked about. What's the event? So we know it's Jesus. That's who the Ancient of Days is. That's who we're talking about. But what's happening in this scene? How does it relate to the end times? Well, if we look at verse 10 and compare it to passages from Revelation 20, we get an insight there. So in verse 4, the first part of verse 4 in Revelation 20, we find out what the thrones are. Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. So Daniel said he saw many thrones. Revelation 20 verse 4 says that there's thrones. But then in Daniel 7:9, it said he saw the Ancient of Days take his seat, right? And then he goes on to say that the court sat in judgment and the books were opened. Well, if we stick in Revelation 20, but go down to verses 11 and 12, it says, "Then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. From his presence, earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne. And guess what? The books were opened." Then another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged by what was written in the books according to what they had done. So, what Daniel is describing in chapter 7, verses 9 and 10, it's judgment day. It is when Jesus sits on the great white throne, and those of us who are given authority to judge with him are seated on our thrones. But since he is the chief judge, he is the one who sits on the great white throne. That's when the books are opened and people are judged. So that's what's being described in this vision in Daniel. But there's another one if we jump ahead in Daniel 7 to verse 13 and 14. And this is a different scene. This is not the same vision. As you can see at the beginning of verse 13, it says, I saw in the night visions. It's plural. So at the beginning of Daniel 7, it says that he saw these things in the first year of Belshazzar's reign. That was the son of Nebuchadnezzar. So we don't know if Daniel had all these visions in a single night or if he had them at different times, but all within that first year of Belshazzar's reign. But we do know that we are now shifting into a new vision. So this is not to be conflated with what Daniel saw in verses 9 and 10. This is a different moment. And we also now see more than Jesus being addressed in this passage. So let's read it together and see if we can discern who's being talked about and what's happening here. So he says, he saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. Okay, so we already saw that in Revelation 1, Jesus being described as one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. So there's two different beings described here. You have one like a son of man, and he's now coming to the Ancient of Days and being presented before him. And it's to him, the one like a son of man that's coming on the clouds of heaven, to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So, what is happening here? Who's being described? Because in the passage in 9 and 10, Jesus is called the Ancient of Days. But then in this passage, it's clearly describing Jesus as the one like a son of man who gets the dominion and whose kingdom is established. But who's the Ancient of Days in this vision? Because Jesus is being presented to the Ancient of Days, who is therefore giving him dominion. Well, we know that's God the Father, right? So I know that this can be confusing. It's like, wait a second. So in 9 and 10, Jesus is called Ancient of Days, but in 13, 14, God the Father is called Ancient of Days. How does this work? Well, it reminds me of Psalm 110, verse 1, that says, the Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. And in the Hebrew, it literally says, Yahweh says to my Adonai. Clearly, it is God the Father speaking to Jesus. They are both the Ancient of Days because they are both from eternity past. They are coexistent, they are co equal, they're made of the same substance. They both always existed. So God the Father is Ancient of Days, God the Son is Ancient of Days, and God the Spirit is Ancient of Days. So what we're seeing in 9 and 10 is Jesus, the Ancient of Days, taking the throne to do judgment. And in 13, 14, this is when the Son, one like a Son of Man, Jesus goes to God the Father, the Ancient of Days, and that's when his kingdom gets established on the earth. And so, like I said, this reminds me of Psalm 110. The Lord says to my Lord. And in fact, Jesus himself quotes this psalm in Matthew 22, verses 42 to 45, to establish it as a messianic prophecy and even to help the Pharisees understand how Jesus could be the Son of God and also be God. Okay. And then finally, the same psalm is quoted in Hebrews 1:13, again, talking about Jesus. So if Psalm 110, the Lord says to my Lord, is God the Father saying to Jesus, well, then in Daniel 7, 13 and 14, one like a son of man, Jesus is being presented to the Ancient of Days, God the Father, but also in that other vision, Jesus himself is also referred to as the Ancient of Days. We're talking about the Trinity here. So what's the event? So that's the who. Now what's the what? I believe that the Daniel 7, 13, and 14 vision is the new heavens and new earth. And that gets described in Revelation chapter 21. I'm not going to read the whole chapter to you, but I want to point out a few things in the first 7 verses as to why I think the vision in 13, Daniel 7, 13, and 14 is about this point, which is after Judgment Day. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. Hallelujah. That's what we're waiting for, right? And he who is seated on the throne, Jesus Christ, said, Behold, I am making all things new. Also, he said, Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. And again, he said to John, It is done. I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Sounds like Ancient of Days to me. Okay, so Jesus is sitting on the throne in judgment, but he also later sits on the throne to reign in that everlasting kingdom that is going to be established. And he closes out this particular section with, To the thirsty I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. The one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. Okay, so just to wrap up Daniel 7, that the vision in 9 and 10 is Judgment Day, and Jesus is referred to as the Ancient of Days, and then 13, 14 is when Jesus is establishing his kingdom, and in that one, God the Father is referred to as the Ancient of Days. Okay, so now what I want to do is share with you something that I'm putting together that I want you to do the same. And as we go through these lessons, keep adding details. But basically, it's the timeline of what is to come. Okay, so we know that there are certain events that will lead up to Daniel's final week, the last 7 years. And that includes the rise of a global government. Many of us call that the New World Order. But that's reflected in the 10 toes of Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar's vision, or the 10 horns on the fourth beast in Daniel 7, or also in the vision of the beast in Revelation 13. It's the seventh head on that beast that also has the 10 horns. So there's going to be some sort of coalition alliance, whether it's a literal 10 or that 10 is symbolic, but we do know that there's going to be a global government that rises up, and that's going to lead up to the final 7 years, because what's going to kick off the final 7 years is a peace agreement that allows religious Jews to either build a temple or a tabernacle, something where they can have an altar and resume the sacrificial system that has been put on halt ever since 70 AD when the second temple was destroyed. So somewhere there has to be a peace agreement. We get that from Daniel 9, and it says that the final week, the final 7 years, it begins with the covenant made with many. But we also find out from Daniel 9 that midway through the week, or 3.5 years in, the Antichrist is going to put an end to the animal sacrifices. So that means that they have to be resumed before they can be stopped again. So somewhere, somehow, there's going to be a peace agreement. They're going to be allowed to resume the sacrificial system, and that's the significance of the red heifers. And that's what we're looking for right now in the Middle East, is some sign of both a global government rising to power as well as a peace agreement that will allow the religious Jews to resume animal sacrifices. Also, in that midway point, we know that the nations handed their power over to the Antichrist. In Daniel 7, he saw that as a little horn that rises up amongst the 10 horns, and in that rise to power, uproots 3 of them. And in Revelation 17, there's 7 heads on the beast, and the seventh head has the 10 horns. But John also says that there's an eighth head, but it belongs to the seven. So that's kind of how it's showing up in these different visions, whether it's a little horn, whether it's an eighth head that seems to rise up, but it belongs to the seven. But that's the Antichrist figure, the final Nimrod. He's going to put an end to the animal sacrifices. He's going to speak haughty and blasphemous words against God. He's going to make war on the saints and prevail until Jesus comes. We know then, again from Daniel 9, that from the point of the animal sacrifices being ended to the point when the abomination of desolation, the beast is ultimately destroyed because Jesus returns and takes care of that. And there's another 3.5 years. So that's going to be what we're going to be focusing on is 3.5 years. The first 3.5 years and the second 3.5 years, with many significant events happening at that midway point and putting things into motion. Okay. And then after Jesus returns, as we already read, the books are open, people are judged, heavens and earth are dissolved, new heavens, new earth are established. Jesus's kingdom is permanently established. So this is what we're going to be working through, is building out this future timeline, or this timeline of future events. And that what I just shared with you is what we've studied so far. So everything we've seen in Daniel 2, 7, 9, I included some things that we learned in Daniel or in Revelation 13 and 17 about the beast. But now what I want to do is dive into Daniel chapters 11 and 12, because there's a lot in those chapters that also speak to the end times that we can continue to fill in this timeline. So that's where we're going to go next, is diving into Daniel chapter 11. But like I said, we're going to keep building on this timeline. So at the end of the lesson, I'll pull it back up with all the new insights that we're going to gain plugged into it. So some context about Daniel 11 before we dive in. Daniel 11 contains 135 prophecies that spans more than 375 years. And we're not going to go through all of them, okay? But it is considered one of the passages of prophetic scripture that is the most detailed and the most accurate, because all these events have taken place. So Daniel's looking into the future, describing what he's seeing is going to come. But now we have the benefit of hindsight, and we can check what he saw against what we know actually happened. And it's pretty cool to see how accurate it is. So what I did, for those who are curious, I created a document that goes through all the historical events that are predicted in Daniel 11, but I also included the other historical events that we've talked about in previous lessons, so that we can have that full picture of everything that has already transpired, so that we can understand what scripture is talking about, but also because we know that we're living in these iterations of Nimrod rising up, trying to establish a one world government, one world religion before God puts it down. And we know that that's going to continue until that final Antichrist, when the events of Revelation completely unfold and Jesus returns. And I believe we're in that final iteration. And if not, then it's going to be soon. It's going to be my children or my grandchildren. But because of events that are happening right now, we are seeing things happen that have never happened before, that have never happened in any previous iteration. So I think something significant is occurring in our days. And that's why it's so essential to understand these prophecies, because Jesus himself said, be awake and ready. Do not be led astray. And Paul tells us to speak about Jesus's return as a means of encouragement, because we are supposed to last through all these events. No matter what comes our way, we're supposed to stay loyal and faithful to Jesus. And that's important to understand, so that we can be ready for that, but also we can stay on mission, and we can bring that fullness of the Gentiles in. We can continue to spread the gospel. We can continue to bring souls to Christ. And that's what is important about our study. It's not just to know these things so that we can go hide away. It's so that we're awake, we're ready, we're on mission, we don't get led astray, and we share what we know so that others aren't led astray either. Okay, so what I'm going to do is in Daniel 11, I'm going to highlight a few key events in the first few verses, and then we're going to jump down to where I want to focus the rest of our lesson. And like I said, I'm going to provide a document. It's going to be linked to in the description of the video. So if you want all the other prophecies that are described in this chapter, you're welcome to have them. Okay, so let's jump into Daniel 11. So starting in verse 1. And as for me, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. So Darius the Mede is actually more like a governor or a vassal state king under King Cyrus of Persia. That's why we refer to this kingdom as the Mede-Persian Empire or the Mede-Persian Kingdom. And so this is the first year that Darius the Mede is in that role. And Daniel goes up to him to encourage him, and he shares the following vision. He says, "And now I will show you the truth." He's talking to Darius the Mede. "Behold, three more kings shall arise in Persia, and a fourth shall be far richer than all of them." Okay, so he's telling Darius that there's going to be three more kings in Persia, and then there'll be a fourth, and he's going to be far richer. And when that fourth one, when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. This happens. This is Xerxes from the story of Esther. Now, not everything that Xerxes did is captured in the book of Esther. However, I want to connect those two because that's what Daniel's describing. He's describing the rise of Xerxes, who ends up going after the kingdom of Greece. Okay, so this actually happens, okay? Then he actually jumps forward about 150 years in this next verse. "Then a mighty king shall arise." He's talking about Alexander the Great. And so this mighty king, Alexander the Great, who shall rule with the great dominion and do as he wills. And as soon as he is arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these. So what happens is Alexander the Great dies, but he has no heir. So his kingdom is broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven. It's broken up amongst four generals, not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled. Nope, it's his military generals who take his kingdom and divide it into four parts. So it happens exactly as Daniel envisioned it. Okay, but something I want to explain, because if you read through the rest of the prophecies, Daniel starts talking about a king of the north and a king of the south. And he's still talking about the Greek Empire broken up into these four places, but he's only going to be talking about the two that affect Israel. So even though he is right, the kingdom, the Greek Empire, after Alexander the Great dies, it does get divided into four. Only two of them affect the land of Israel. You have the king of the north, which refers to Syria. They are also called the Seleucids, and their leaders are referred to with the title of Antiochus. The king of the south is Egypt, and their leaders are referred to by the title of Ptolemy. And it is this back and forth between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies trying to control the region of Israel because it is a major trade route. Okay. What's also important to note is that these events take place in the intertestamental period. It's the time between the end of the Old Testament with Malachi and the start of the New Testament in the book of Matthew. So this is all happening in that middle point part. However, some of the events that take place are captured in other deuterocanonical texts, including 1st and 2nd Maccabees. So I'm going to have us jump down to verse 21, and we're going to be looking at the event that we now commemorate with Hanukkah. And that's all captured in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. But also, what happens in this period is the translation of the Old Testament scriptures from Hebrew to Greek. Because one of the things that Alexander the Great did was he required everybody to learn Greek. So over the years, Jewish people lost their language. They started to speak Greek and they forgot how to read, write, and understand Hebrew. So they wanted their scriptures. And it was the Ptolemy. It was not the king of the north, it was the king of the south who commissioned the translation of the Septuagint, or sorry, of the Torah into Greek. And that was the start of the Septuagint. And then, of course, they continued on and ended up translating all of the Old Testament into Greek. And why we need to know that is in the New Testament, anywhere that Jesus or any of the apostles quote the Old Testament scriptures, they're quoting the Septuagint. Okay, so that's why sometimes you might read the English translation of the Old Testament and the English translation of the New Testament, where, say, one of the apostles is quoting the Old Testament, and it's not exactly the same. It's because in the Protestant Bible, our Old Testament was translated straight from Hebrew to English, but where they're quoting the Septuagint, that means it went from Hebrew to Greek to English. So that's why you can sometimes look and go, wait a second, it says Jesus is quoting Isaiah 61, but it doesn't match word for word what I read in Isaiah 61 for myself. That's why. So the Septuagint is important because that is what gets quoted by Jesus and the apostles in the New Testament. And that took place in this intertestamental period when the Ptolemies happened to be in control of Israel. But like I said, they go back and forth between the king of the north and the king of the south, taking turns kind of being in control. But at some point, Rome rises to power. And Rome is the one who starts to conquer everything that was previously the Greek Empire. And that is important to note because when we do open up our New Testament and we see that the Roman Empire is now in control of Israel, there were again significant events that were taking place that still affected Israel in that intertestamental period, but doesn't necessarily affect the salvation story or the gospel. But I want to explain what's happening there for two reasons. One, it's captured in Daniel 11, and it's given quite a long section. It's Daniel 11, 21 to 35. That's the Hanukkah story. But also because the character who is the one who is doing all these atrocities that are captured in that story, Antiochus Epiphanes, he is a Nimrod. So what he's doing, even though we know it has already been done, it was done in the past, it is still a type and a figure, and we can look at the things that he did as a foreshadow of the things that the final Antichrist, the final rise of Nimrod, will do. So that's why we're going to dive into these passages. But note, they have already taken place. However, they're also a foreshadow because that was the last iteration of this particular Nimrod. And so we're now looking forward to that same Nimrod rising again in the future and doing similar things. So going back to Daniel 11, this time starting in verse 21, it says, in his place shall arise a contemptible person. That contemptible person is Antiochus the Fourth, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes, referred to as Antiochus the Madman in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and we'll see why here in a bit. So now what's interesting is it says that Antiochus the Fourth, Antiochus Epiphanes, to whom royal majesty has not been given, he shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. We know that that's how Antiochus Epiphanes came to power. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, and he shall become strong with a small people. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province, and he shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. And we know that this is the type of thing that he did. He was ushering in actions that previous Antiochus leaders did not do. So this all is exactly a perfect description of Antiochus Epiphanes. Continuing on verse 25. And he, Antiochus Epiphanes, shall stir up his power in his heart against the king of the south. Remember, that's Egypt, with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for plots shall be devised against him. Remember that. Even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. And as for the two kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail. For the end is yet to be at the time appointed. And he shall return. Antiochus Epiphanes returns to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the Holy Covenant, and he shall work his will and return to his own land. So that's what Daniel saw. And what I want us to do is now read the historical account of what we know to be true about what happened and compare the vision with reality. So what I have on the next screen, there we go, is Wikipedia. Okay, so I'm going to read to you portions of the Wikipedia article that describes Antiochus Epiphanes. So, after his ascension, he took care to maintain good relations with the Roman Republic, even sending an embassy to Rome in 173 BC with a part of the unpaid indemnity still owed from the 188 BC Treaty of Apamea. While there, the embassy secured a renewed treaty of friendship and alliance with Rome, greatly helped by the fact Antiochus had come to power with the help of Eumenes II, Rome's principal ally in the region. So remember how it says that he came to power? So the guardians of King Ptolemy VI Philometor demanded the return of Coel Syria in 170 BC, declaring war on the Seleucids on the assumption that the kingdom was divided after Antiochus's murder of his nephew. Okay, so remember King Ptolemy, that's Egypt. Okay, Seleucids, that's Syria, that's Antiochus's area. So now here's that war that Daniel foresaw. However, Antiochus had warning on the attack and had prepared more thoroughly. He had already built his forces and moved them into position. And as soon as the Egyptian forces left Pelusium, they were attacked and defeated by Antiochus IV and his Seleucid army. Daniel foresaw that. The Seleucids then seized Pelusium, giving them supplies and access to all of Egypt. He advanced into Egypt proper, that's Antiochus did, conquering all but Alexandria. That's important, and he captured the king. He captured King Ptolemy. This was partially achieved because Rome, who was Ptolemaic Egypt's traditional ally, was embroiled in the Third Macedonian War and was not willing to become involved elsewhere. So, to avoid alarming Rome, Antiochus allowed Ptolemy VI to continue ruling as a puppet king from Memphis. So then Antiochus goes home, just like we just read. He goes home. However, because he didn't conquer the city of Alexandria, they choose a new king, one of Ptolemy's brothers. And the Ptolemy brothers reconcile and agree to rule Egypt jointly instead of fighting a civil war. Okay, so all of this it matches what Daniel foresaw. So this was Antiochus Epiphanes' first time going into Egypt, but he does it again. So if you remember, it says, but he's going to go home, right? And then things are going to be happening and until the appointed time. Well, in verse 29, that appointed time was 2 years later. So at the time appointed, Antiochus Epiphanes returns and comes into the south. Again, he goes back to Egypt. However, it shall not be this time as it was before, because ships of Kittim, Rome, shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and he shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the Holy Covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. So, so Antiochus Epiphanes goes back to Egypt when he finds out that Ptolemy VI is no longer acting as a puppet king, but is coordinating with his brother and wanting to rule Egypt as they had been ruling Egypt. And he goes in to try to gain power again, but this time Rome does get involved. So it is not like it was the first time. Instead, Antiochus is afraid. He does withdraw. He is angry when he leaves. So going back to Wikipedia, it says in 168 BC, Antiochus led a second attack on Egypt and also sent a fleet to capture Cyprus. But before he reached Alexandria, his path was blocked by a single elderly Roman ambassador named Gaius Popilius Lanus, who delivered a message from the Roman Senate directing Antiochus to withdraw his armies from Egypt and Cyprus, or consider himself in a state of war with the Roman Republic, which there's no way Antiochus could have stood against the Roman Republic. So Antiochus says he would discuss it with his council, whereupon the Roman envoy actually draws a line in the sand around Antiochus and said, before you leave this circle, give me a reply that I can take back to the Roman Senate. This implied Rome would declare war if the king stepped out of the circle without committing to leave Egypt immediately. Weighing his options, Antiochus decided to withdraw. Only then did Popilius agree to shake hands with him. Ancient sources and traditional historiography describe this day of Ulysses as a great humiliation for Antiochus IV that unhinged him for a time. Remember what I said about him being described as Antiochus the madman. Some more modern historians conjecture that Antiochus may have been more reconciled to this than ancient sources indicate, as the Roman intervention meant that Antiochus had been given an excuse to not undertake a potentially long and costly siege of Alexandria. He could instead return with treasure and loot, having weakened the Egyptian state at little risk and cost compared to a larger scale invasion. So this is where we are in the story. Okay, so he goes back to Egypt, Rome steps in, he leaves. Okay, so then going back to Daniel's vision, forces from him, Antiochus Epiphanes, shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering. And they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. This is why people get confused, because this has already happened. There's already been a Nimrod figure who puts an end to the regular burnt offering, who does set up an abomination of desolation in the temple. But that doesn't mean it's not going to happen again. And in fact, when in the next lesson we talk about Matthew 24, Jesus makes reference to this, but he talks about it as a future event. Clearly, he's aware that it's already happened, because we know that Jesus celebrated Hanukkah, and that's what Hanukkah is about, right? Is this event. So, yes, it's already happened, but guess what? It's going to happen again. So, what Antiochus Epiphanes is doing here, it is a foreshadow, and it's something that's important for us to understand, so that when we read Jesus's words and warnings, we have a sense of what might occur based off of what this particular Nimrod did. Okay, so verse 32, he shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. And the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery, and some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end. For it, the time of the end, still awaits the appointed time. This is the transition in Daniel's vision from the past to the future. So 21 through 35 describes events with Antiochus Epiphanes, who is a type and a figure of Nimrod, an Antichrist figure. And what he does is important for us to understand, but it then is going to shift, and everything after verse 35 is going to describe the time of the end, which is still to come. But let's finish off this story. Let's finish off what we know happened with Antiochus Epiphanes. Back to Wikipedia. Local revolts against the Seleucid Empire were not unusual, but most were not successful. The revolt that Antiochus IV ultimately triggered in Judea was unusually well chronicled and preserved, however. According to the book of 2nd Maccabees, the crisis had its origins in the years leading up to the Sixth Syrian War. In 171 BC, Antiochus had deposed the high priest Jason. So that was the correct high priest, but now Antiochus deposed him and replaced him with his guy, Menelaus, who had offered Antiochus a large bribe to secure the office. In 168 BC, when Antiochus was campaigning in Egypt, okay, a rumor spread in Judea that he had been killed. So Jason gathered a force of 1,000 soldiers and made a surprise attack on the city of Jerusalem. Menelaus was forced to flee Jerusalem during the ensuing riot. Jason's intention may have been to retake his former office by force and present his reassumption of power as fait accompli to the regency that would take power in the wake of the king's death, assuming that they would allow him to stay in power rather than invite further conflict during a delicate political moment. But Antiochus wasn't dead. He was still alive, and he returned from Egypt enraged. Okay? So this is the Hanukkah story, right? So he comes enraged. By the reverse, he had suffered at the hands of the Romans, so he's humiliated by Rome, but he's now also enraged hearing at what's happening in Jerusalem and the Jews' rejection of his chosen candidate for high priest. So he attacks Jerusalem, he restores Menelaus, he executes many Jews. So, according to First Maccabees, after restoring Menelaus, Antiochus IV issued decrees aimed at helping the most enthusiastically pro-Greek faction of Hellenized Jews against the traditionalists. He outlawed Jewish religious rites and traditions, and the temple in Jerusalem was forcibly changed to a syncretic Greek Jewish cult that included worship of Zeus. Okay, So this is important to note that the abomination of desolation that Antiochus Epiphanes brought about, it was to come in, desecrate the temple, and commit it to the worship of Zeus. But it goes far worse than that. The Greek historian Diodorus wrote that Antiochus sacrificed a great swine, a pig, at the image of Moses and at the altar of God that stood in the outward court. And he sprinkled them with the blood of the sacrifice. He commanded likewise that the books by which they were taught to hate all other nations should be sprinkled with the broth made of swine's flesh. And he put out the lamp called by them immortal, which burns continually in the temple. That's the light of the presence. That's supposed to represent God's presence in the temple, and they put it out. Lastly, he forced the high priest and the other Jews to eat swine's flesh. And that's a huge deal. Okay. Just think about kosher eating. The rules in the Old Testament, pigs were unclean. So the fact that they came in and sacrificed a pig on the altar, they sprinkled everything with the blood in the of the pig, as well as a broth made with the pig's flesh. The fact that they forced the high priest and Jews to eat it, the fact that they put out the light of the presence. This is the abomination of desolation. Okay, I want you to remember this so that when we get to Matthew 24 and Jesus says that there will be another abomination of desolation, it may look like this or it may be inspired by this. It may have some elements of this. It may not be exact, but we can see that it is an utter desecration. Okay. And so we can see from the rest of the article or this portion of the article that, again, this was a departure from typical Seleucid practice, who normally didn't suppress local religions in their empire, but they were doing this to punish the revolt and to take away autonomy, to repeal local shrines. The city of Jerusalem was sacked a second time in the disorder. Antiochus established a military Greek citadel called the Acra in Jerusalem to serve as a stronghold for Hellenized Jews, and a Greek military garrison. And we know that this happened from 168 BC to 167 BC. Now, the good news is that this did not last. And the Jews, and this is what's captured in the story of Hanukkah and what's celebrated in the story of Hanukkah, is that there was a small group of Jews who rose up, who successfully regained control of Jerusalem and regained control of the temple. And they were able to cleanse the temple, clear out all of that stuff that shouldn't have been there, and they were able to relight the lamp, the light of the presence. However, they found that they only had enough olive oil for the lamp for one night. So they went ahead and lit it because they wanted to rededicate the temple to Yahweh. That's what Hanukkah means, is dedication. So they're celebrating the rededication of the temple, as well as the restoration of worship. Okay, and that covenant that they had with Yahweh. So the miracle of Hanukkah is that it took them 7 days to cleanse themselves from fighting and battle and touching dead bodies and all of these different things that would otherwise defile them. It takes 7 days to cleanse themselves, and then one day to make a new batch of oil. But the one day's worth of oil that they lit on that first day, that's the miracle. It lasted all 8 nights. And so that's what's celebrated with the story of Hanukkah, which we know Jesus celebrated from the Gospels. And it is something that is special and available to any of us. It's not a requirement, it's not even a requirement for the Orthodox Jews, but it is an incredible testimony of the Lord raising up a small remnant of faithful believers to overcome this Antichrist, the damage that the Antichrist was doing, to restore worship, to rededicate the temple, but also the miraculous intervention of God and Him establishing His presence. And so that's what Hanukkah is about. And that's what is captured in Daniel 11:21 to 35, which we know from historical accounts was exactly right. It is extremely detailed, what Daniel saw, and to see that it comes true just like he saw, that just gives us more and more confidence in our scriptures, as well as the rest of his prophecies, including the prophecy of the end times, which we transition into in verse 36. Okay. So now something I want to say real quick. I'm not going to be taking us through Daniel 8. Some people, when they read Daniel 8, they believe that it also contains prophecies about the end times. However, when I read it, I don't see any language that points to the end of days like Daniel 11 does, like Daniel 9 does. I just don't see that. And in fact, what I believe Daniel 8 is, it is prophetic and was future oriented for Daniel, but it's a more detailed account of the transition of power between the Mede Persian Empire and the Greek Empire with Alexander the Great. So if you read Daniel 8 and you see it being a foreshadow of something to come in the future, because Alexander the Great would also be considered a Nimrod, an Antichrist figure. So that is definitely possible. And I would not say that that would be wrong. I just don't personally see it. So that's why I'm not going to take us through it. But for sure, there's other people who have their own interpretation, their own understanding. And I'm sure a lot of what they see is also valid. But what we're going to focus on are those things that we know for sure are prophecies about the end times because they say so. Okay, so let's continue on going through Daniel 11. We're going to pick up in verse 36, and I'm going to continue all the way through the end of chapter 12. So we're going to now look at all the passages that Daniel has in these two chapters about the end times. So starting in verse 36, and the king, the final Antichrist, shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god. He shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished. For what is decreed shall be done. Okay. So I just want to make a point of that we already know he's going to speak haughty and blasphemous things against God. And that's what this is saying. At some point, the Antichrist will rise up, exalt himself, magnify himself above all the gods, including the one true God, and he shall prosper, right? We already know that he shall make war on the saints and prevail until Jesus comes. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished. And God says all of this that he's decreed, it will come to pass. Verse 37, he, the Antichrist, shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other God, for he shall magnify himself above all. He shall honor the God of fortresses instead of these, a God whom his father did not know. He shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign God. Those who acknowledge him, he shall load with honor. He shall make them rulers over many and shall divide the land for a price. So he's going to exalt himself. I believe he's going to present himself as Jesus returned, as the Messiah of the Jewish people who are still believing the Messiah hasn't yet come, as well as the figure that Muslims are waiting for, their own kind of messianic figure. So when we look at, well, who's a God whom his fathers didn't know? Who's a foreign God? Well, the God that is acknowledged after Christ is Allah, because Muhammad says he had his first vision in 610 AD. So that's when the religion of Islam was established. So this is my thoughts on it. I believe that the Antichrist is going to claim to be this messianic figure. He's going to claim to be divine, but he's going to honor Allah, the God of the Muslims. And you're going to see here in a moment when we shift into chapter 12, another reference to Muslims. But for me, I think Allah is the best fit for this description of a God whom his fathers didn't know and a foreign God. Okay. So then continuing on in verse 40, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind with chariots and horsemen and with many ships. And he shall come into countries and shall overflow and pass through. And he shall come into the glorious land. And we know glorious land is a reference to Israel. Okay, so anytime we see in Daniel, even earlier when he was talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, there's another place where he says he comes into the glorious land. He's talking about Israel. So we don't know what these events will look like yet because this is future oriented. So the king of the south, it could still be a reference to Egypt, But since this is now future oriented, it could also potentially make a reference to maybe Saudi Arabia. I don't know. When we look at what's south of Israel, of the glorious land, and who may try to attack or push back, I don't know. But it could be Saudi Arabia, it could be Egypt, we're not sure. But the king of the north, that's now the Antichrist, is going to rush upon him like a whirlwind with all these troops, with all this powerful army and all these things. He's going to come into countries, he's going to overflow, he's going to pass through, he's going to end up in Israel. And tens of thousands shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand. And this is interesting. So when the Antichrist leads this army into the Middle East, tens of thousands are going to fall, but it says, here's who's spared: Edom, who we know are descendants of Esau, Moab, and the main part of the Ammonites. And Ammon and Moab are people groups who descended from the incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughters. Okay. And so the Edomites, the Moabites, and the Ammonites were historically enemies of Israel because of this, because of that connection to Esau, as well as their historical connection to Lot and his daughters. So when we look at that, they're spared. And if we look at, okay, where was that in the past? Who is that referring to now? Because there's no longer any countries called Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Well, here we go. I've looked up some maps. So on the left is a historical map, and I tried to kind of position them side by side and orient us around the Dead Sea. Okay, so on the left, you can see Israel and Judah. So that'll be the northern and southern kingdoms of the divided kingdom of Israel from the Bible. And you see to the right, you have the kingdom of Ammon, kingdom of Moab, kingdom of Edom. Okay, so that's the past, that's the biblical time period. So, what about modern day map, modern day countries? And if you look at them side by side, you can see that the majority of Ammon, Moab, and Edom is modern day Jordan. Portion of Edom is now in modern day Israel, but I think it's a reference to Jordan. Okay, so when we look at this end time when the Antichrist is coming in and he's entering into the Middle East, he's entering into Israel, there's going to be something with Jordan, where Jordan gets spared. And so we need to be watching for that. So as we start to look at events unfold into the future, who is this Antichrist figure? Well, the Antichrist is going to rise up out of this global government. So that's the first question: is what's going to be this final global government? And are they going to have any kind of deal, any kind of alliance with Jordan? Because Jordan gets spared. Okay. So continuing on then, verse 42 and 43, he, the final Antichrist, shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. That's why I'm wondering if the king of the south isn't like either Saudi Arabia or something else, because he speaks about Egypt separately. He's no longer using king of the south as a euphemism for Egypt. Okay. But anyway, so the land of Egypt doesn't escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and silver and all the precious things of Egypt. And then it says the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. So in Ezekiel 38 and 39, we see Put and Cush. And Put refers to regionally what we would call Libya. So the Libyans here in Daniel 11, it's the same people group in Ezekiel 38 and 39, who I believe is describing the same war that we're going to be reading about here, which is the Armageddon. I believe that's a reference to African Muslims. So Put or Libya. And then the Cushites, Cush is modern day Iran. And so basically what this is saying is Egypt is going to get conquered. Okay, Jordan will be spared, but Egypt will be conquered. And then the Libyans or Put, and then the Cushites or Iran, they shall follow in his train. Now, that's not talking about a locomotive, right? Those didn't exist in the time of Daniel. He's talking about the train of a robe. So in my mind, he's talking about riding coattails. So the African Muslims, okay, which I think represent Libyans and or Put from Ezekiel 38 and 39, Cushites, Iran. Okay, well, if we look, those are two different groups of Muslims, because we know that the main divide, the main denomination or sectal divide within the Muslims is Sunni and Shia. Well, Iran is 90 to 95% Shia Muslims. That's the Cushites. Libya, if we're actually looking at Libya itself, is 97% Sunni, and Egypt is 95% Sunni. So, what I'm wondering is that when this Antichrist comes in, if he doesn't do something that heals the divide or brings together the Shia and the Sunni Muslims. Like I said, he honors a foreign god, a god his fathers don't know. We have both the Shia Muslims of Kush of Iran and the Sunni Muslims of Put or Libya riding his coattails. We see him dominating the Sunnis in Egypt. Um, I'm not sure. Okay, so I'm just kind of putting this out there about these places and people groups that Daniel's seeing in a vision a millennia ago, and versus what we know about today geographically and how I see it coming together. So I think that's something to pay attention to. And like I said, potentially even the Antichrist claiming to be that messianic Muslim figure that they're waiting for. That might be what heals that divide and brings the Sunni and the Shia together. I don't know. Okay, so that's what's happening in the physical. Okay. So is all this stuff is happening. Now it does say news from the east and the north shall alarm the Antichrist, and he shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. Again, there's no way to know for sure what that's going to mean. When he says news from the east, well, what's east? Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, China, all of those are east. So I don't know if something's going to come that way. What's north? North could be Russia. Okay, it could be Eastern Europe. I don't know. So he's going to hear something, and we're not sure what that is. What I wonder too is we know that as that little horn, that when he rises to power amongst the 10, he uproots three. Maybe there's something there where the three that got uprooted aren't too happy about being uprooted, because we know Russia is a part of the beast. So maybe Russia gets uprooted and then makes a deal with either Iran, but Iran's going to be riding his coattails, so it wouldn't be Iran. Maybe China? I don't know. So this could be, Russia getting uprooted, not happy, making a deal with China. I don't know. So whatever this is going to be, okay. We do know that the Antichrist is going to go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction, and he's going to pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. That's a reference to Mount Zion, which is in Jerusalem. Yet he, the Antichrist, that final beast, shall come to his end with none to help him. So we know that he is bringing people together in Israel for a final battle. And he is setting himself up between the sea and the glorious mountain of Mount Zion. And problem is, for him anyway, he's going to come to an end. He's going to meet his end, that he is not going to prevail any further. That's the furthest that he's going to go, because then Jesus is going to come back and destroy him. Okay. And that's how I compare it is I look at what was just described there to Revelation 19 and 20, where John sees the beast and the kings of the earth with their armies gathered to make war against him who was sitting on the horse and against his army. That's Jesus. And the beast is captured, and with it the false prophet, who in its presence had done the signs by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshiped its image. Those two, the beast, the Antichrist, and the false prophet, are thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. So we see in Daniel 7, the beast gets burned with fire. We see here that's the same thing that John sees in Revelation 19, the beast, the Antichrist, and the false prophet get burned with fire. And then as we just saw in Daniel 11, that the Antichrist, he goes to make war, but he doesn't realize it's actually his end. Okay. So then we transition. So that we're going to continue reading through into Daniel 12, because those two chapters flow together. They continue on together. So what we just saw was happening in the natural, but here we get a glimpse into what's happening in the unseen realm, the spiritual realm. So at that time, when the beast, the Antichrist, and the kings of the earth, and they have their armies and they're all setting up for battle, guess what? Michael, the great prince, the archangel who has charge of God's people, he gets released from heaven. Okay, so he gets activated. Him and the host of heaven, they get activated, and it says, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. I believe that's God's wrath being poured out. Okay. So I think all this stuff happens, and we know the Antichrist is allowed to prevail. He's allowed to do all this until the indignation is complete. He's allowed to do this until Christ comes back, right? And when he does, when the enemy is confronted, that's when God's wrath is poured out. Here's the good news for us. It then says, but, okay, at that time, your people, God's people, shall be delivered. Who does that include? Everyone whose name shall be found written in the book of life. This is the rapture. Okay, so we know that all this stuff is going to be setting up in the natural. In the spirit, Michael and the host of heaven is going to be released. They're going to be going down, setting up to release God's wrath, okay, on the beast and everyone who follows him. But God's people, everyone's name is written in the book of life. We are delivered, we are spared from that, okay? So I believe in a pre-God wrath rapture. We do not experience God's wrath because Jesus experienced it for us on the cross. We are spared. What we are not spared from is the Antichrist and the Great Tribulation and Satan's wrath. That's what we're not spared from, but we are spared from God's wrath. And it goes on to describe how many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. I think this is describing our glorified bodies because we know that when we are raptured, when we are caught up into the clouds, okay, because Jesus comes in on the cloud, when we are caught up to him, we are transformed into our heavenly bodies, our glorified bodies. So I think what Daniel is seeing is that when the people, God's people, are delivered, when they are awakened to everlasting life, they are those who are dead. We know those who are dead rise first and they're resurrected, but those of us who are alive are then caught up into the sky. We don't have to die first, but we are then transformed on our way to meet Christ in the clouds. And I believe that that's what Daniel's seeing. Okay, we'll get more into what I'm talking about in the next couple of lessons, where we're going to dive into what Jesus says about end times in Matthew 24 and Luke 21. That's our next lesson. And then the lesson after that, we'll dive into the writings of Paul and Peter and what they have to say about the end times. And what I'm referring to is some of the things that Paul describes. So this is the end of the angel speaking to Daniel, and he tells Daniel, shut up the words, seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. So this is very, very true, because what I've read is that for millennia, Jewish people, even early Christians, didn't understand Daniel. This has been a mystery for millennia. They didn't understand. But now we have the benefit of hindsight with the historical documents and accounts that verify the prophecies that Daniel gave about events that have already happened. And because of that, we can trust that the prophecies of the events that have not yet happened are going to happen with the same accuracy and the same detail. Okay. So then, now this is Daniel talking. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others stood, one on this bank of the stream and one on that bank of the stream. And someone said to the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the stream, how long shall it be till the end of these wonders? And I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream. He raised his right hand and his left hand toward heaven, and he swore by him who lives forever, that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. That's 3.5 years. And if you listen to part two, I said we're going to keep coming across that 3.5 years over and over and over. Time, times, and half a time is one of the key ways that not just Daniel, but we see it in the book of Revelation, that we're going to get that 3.5 years, time, times, and half a time. So I believe here Daniel is asking, and I think it's Jesus answering, the one who's clothed in linen, who's above the waters, who raises his right and left hands to heaven, swears by him who lives forever, because there's nothing higher by which God can swear but himself. And he says, so it says, how long shall it be till the end? of these wonders. So basically, the vision that he's seeing, it starts with the Antichrist rising up, magnifying himself, exalting himself above the other gods, right? So from that point till the end, and Jesus says, swearing by himself, it'll be 3.5 years. Okay. So that's how we start to fill in that Daniel's final 7 years, Daniel's final week, is that we know the Antichrist midway through the week puts a stop to the sacrifices. So that has to be when he also then stands up and exalts himself, because from that point to the end is another 3.5 years. Okay. And it is the end that the verse continues on, and that when the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, all these things would be finished. So, what it's talking about is our earthly power. So, in those final 3.5 years, when there's that great tribulation, when the Antichrist is allowed to make war on the saints and prevail, that he is shattering the worldly power of the holy people, when all of that comes to an end, is when it'll all be finished. So, that's why I believe in a rapture that takes place before God's wrath, but after Satan's tribulation. So I think that we do, as the church, we do go through the all 7 years. I believe we do endure the great tribulation, and but we are raptured before God pours His wrath. And I'll continue to build on that theory in coming lessons. So continuing on in verse 8, I heard, but I did not understand. Okay, so that's important. Daniel, he heard this. It's not even making sense to him. So he said, "Oh, my Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things?" And he said, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end." So basically, Jesus is saying, it's okay, Daniel. You don't need to understand. It's not for you. Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined. That's who he's talking about when it comes to his bride and our wedding garments, which are white and pure, and those are the righteous deeds of the saints. And so what he's talking about is many are going to purify themselves. They are going to make themselves white and be refined. He's talking about his bride. That's us. However, but the wicked shall act wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand. But those who are wise, those who purified themselves, made themselves white and refined, those who are wise shall understand. That's why it's important for us to know these things, that we need to understand so that we're not deceived. We need to understand so that we are wise. We need to understand so that we help others understand. And this particular passage made me think of Ephesians 5. So verses 6 through 8 says, "Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things, the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience." Okay, that's true. Therefore, do not become partners with them. For at one time you were darkness, but now you are light, and the Lord walk as children of light. Okay, so this is exactly what's going to happen. The Antichrist is going to rise up. There's going to be false prophets, false teachers, false gospels. Many are going to be led astray with these deceptive words. Okay, we're not supposed to be among them, nor are we supposed to partner with them, because they're the ones who are going to receive the wrath of God. And in verses 15 to 17, Paul goes on to write, "Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise," right? And look back at Daniel. Who are the wise ones? The ones who understand. "Making the best use of the time, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is." Okay, so like I said, this just reminded me of this passage where even Paul is reiterating, you need to be wise, you need to be understanding, you need to watch how you walk. Don't align yourself with those who are evil and those who are going to be deceived. Okay, so then the book of Daniel, Daniel 12, this is how it closes out. "From the time that the burnt offering, regular burnt offering, is taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days." Guess what? That's 3.5 years. We're back to the 3.5 years. So again, we know halfway through the week, the regular burnt offering is taken away. That's the 3.5 year mark. And from that point until the final abomination of desolation is 3.5 years. So all of that, that's the second 3.5 years. Here's a curious thing. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1,335 days. What's this extra 45 days? I'm not sure. Okay. But it seems like the abomination of desolation is set up at that 1,290th day. Um, but then there's another 45 days. So whatever's going on, we just need to keep waiting. We need to stay faithful in the waiting because blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1,335 days. So whatever those extra 45 days are, whatever they turn out to be, we just got to stay faithful all the way to the end. Okay. And then finally, go your way till the end, and you shall rest. Daniel shall rest. That's a euphemism for dying. Daniel shall die. But guess what? He then shall stand in his allotted place at the end of days. So Daniel is amongst those who have already died, who are righteous, who will be resurrected first when Jesus returns. And so Daniel will be resurrected. He'll be in his glorious body. He shall stand in his allotted place, and he'll be able to watch all these things come about just as God showed him all these millennia ago. So I think that's just an incredible thing. All right, so let's finish filling in our timeline of future events of Daniel's final week. So the new pieces that I put in is the Antichrist exalts himself above all other gods, honors a foreign god his fathers did not know, and we know that that's in the 3.5 year mark. We also know many will purify themselves, be clothed in white, but the wicked shall act wickedly and have no understanding. And I know for me, the Lord used this to comfort me and to help give me peace and patience because years ago, I got really caught up in politics and I was seeing the things that were happening and the decisions being made and things happening around the world. And it was really stirring up this impotent rage within me because there was nothing I could do about it. Not really. I mean, I would vote. I would try to find truth. I would try to support the best candidates that we could. I tried to do all of those things. And of course, I prayed all the time. But it was like, what difference were we making? But then God had to remind me one, these things I've decreed, they shall come about. Why are you so upset that the things I told you are going to happen are happening? That was very true. But also, why are you mad? Why are you upset that the wicked are acting wickedly? Why are you upset that they don't understand? And that actually flipped me from anger to empathy, to pity, where I see all these people who are acting wickedly, who are acting out of ignorance and lack of understanding. And as I said, what's the purpose of this study? One, that we don't be deceived, that we don't fall away, that we are encouraged, even in the midst of our own persecution and tribulation, however it manifests, but also so that we stay on mission and we who are wise, we try to help others understand. And we try to bring those who are stumbling around in the darkness, whether it's the darkness of ignorance, the darkness of evil, or both, and we help bring them into the light. So instead of just being angry and just raging at the TV, instead, I found a peace that surpasses understanding, and I do take encouragement, but I also take a sense of urgency. And for me, especially for those other five virgins who don't have oil, and those who think they are good, who think they're safe, and they're not. And so anyway, so that's why I felt so burdened to share this study with you all. All right, what's the last three things I added into our timeline? The Antichrist comes into Israel, the glorious land, with an army, pitching his tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. That's going to be Armageddon. We'll get into Armageddon and more as the lessons unfold and we see more and more passages describing that event. We know that Archangel Michael arises to do battle, and then the shattering of the power of the holy people will come to an end, and God's people will be delivered, and many who are dead shall resurrect and those who are wise shall shine. Okay, so those are the newest entries to our timeline. And as we continue on through our study, we are going to continue to fill that in. So that's my goal. And I hope that you have found this to be helpful and edifying. And especially as you're watching the news and you're seeing things unfold, what are the sorts of things that should catch our ears, catch our attention? It is the rise of a global government. It is some kind of peace treaty, or the religious Jews being allowed to resume animal sacrifices. These are key events. But when we meet again in our next lesson, Jesus is going to give us even more to be watchful for than what we've already gleaned from the prophecies of Daniel. So we are officially done with the prophecies that we have found in the book of Daniel. But you're going to see next week, it's important that we started there because Jesus is going to make a reference to Daniel and he's going to assume that his audience understands. So I wanted to make sure that we all understood so that we could follow along and we can fully appreciate everything that Jesus is going to say, as well as what the other apostles are going to say, whether it's Paul or Peter, or when we finally do arrive in the book of Revelation, we have a foundation, we have context, we have an understanding that will just allow this study to be richer, for us to be more awake and aware, for us to be more ready, for us to be encouraged to stay faithful to the end, to endure to the end, but also to stay on mission, to keep spreading the good news, spreading the word, because that is what the Lord wants from us. He doesn't want us going and hiding away. He doesn't want us burying our talent in the ground and just waiting for him to return. He wants us to use what he has given us to his glory, for his purposes, for his will. His will be done, his kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. That's what we need to be doing. And so I hope that this is an encouragement, and I hope that you join me for part 4 of this lesson, this study of end times prophecies.